Good morning, good day, good afternoon, greetings, salutations, with a helping side of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me today as we continue our quest for knowledge on our great security journey. And as always, I have to do it twice for the new joiners because me being Tristan Watty, I join you from the AWS Professional Services Division, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And today, we hold that pause for Russ, as he is not able to join, but we will challenge and channel. I was running out of C words, but essentially, we're going to channel our inner Russ to say instant response items. And as always, we like to say, hello, producer Jeff. Thank you for joining in. And I saw the comment from Punch. What even is 10 billion percent? And if you stick around, it is almost a little bit of a deep cut, a reference to a specific show. And that's one of their sayings that, hey, when they are right, they are 10 billion percent right, or I'm 10 billion percent sure. So we're going to wrap it around and say, hey, are you 10 billion percent sure when it comes to your AWS security lifecycle or your overall, let's say, direction from a security standpoint? So thank you for asking that question. And thank you for Ari for saying, hey, and how is everyone? I have that same question, but a little bit different format because I like to know, where's everybody tuning in from, dialing in from, listening from, viewing from, or I guess channeling from. And as always, we always have to have two questions. The second question is an interesting one. So since we are in that show mood, what's your favorite 90s cartoon? This is an interesting one because did you watch it live, or did you watch reruns because you came back to it, or do you not remember any of them at all? Feel free to put inside of the chat kind of the one that you're gravitating towards in your head. Because me, I have to go with all of the different news. The X-Men 90s cartoon, that's kind of up there for me, and especially with recent news and everything along those lines. I'm an excited person, and what I'm also excited about is today's topic because it's a culmination of different things. And one of those things is centered around being 10 billion percent sure. Sorry, I had to do that last callback. But I also have to make the callback to the previous episodes when we started to learn about and view, like, hey, what is this overarching storyline that we're trying to build? What is the messaging? How do we go from cloud forensics to chaos engineering to getting maybe 10 billion alerts? And then how do we have one trigger? And what does that trigger do? And they kind of set us off on this kind of series journey of, hey, let's figure this out. If we were to get so many alerts, how does your organization handle it? How do we kind of think about it? And that's how we started to go back and take a step back a little bit to going down the scientific route, right? With the power of science, where it's just like, okay, there's a scientific method. And we came up with a hypothesis, and we came up with a couple of different items. And thank you for joining in, Lewis. Always a pleasure. I am doing peachy keen and a happy Monday. So the scientific method that we liked to, or we loved to delve in, we'll use a stronger word because it's a great topic to think about, is how do we think about alerts coming into our environment and how do we handle it? What mechanisms do we put in from an automation standpoint, from a human in the loop standpoint, just from all these different pieces that kind of come together? And what drives us to think about these different methodologies? Is it, something like a regulatory framework that we have to kind of adhere to within your particular vertical? Or is it something just, hey, there's leadership that wants to say, hey, we want to do something more. We want to continue to expand. We have places for growth within our business. Or Maybe it was a real life incident or a near miss that happened. These are all different pieces that say, hey, what's driving our overall security program maturity? And we asked a couple of questions when it came to that were interesting. But I would find it very, to use the word again, interesting to see what everybody says. So when you think about it, feel free to put in the chat, what are the items driving your security posture? What is driving your overall kind of thought process when it comes to handling and managing alerts? Or is this a constant item of, hey, we need to do something within our environment. We need to increase our security. I think this is the right way. But how do we do this? So put it in the chat, or you know what? I'll also spin up a poll. So let's say internal push. That's also a nice thing. So feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat to say, hey, what's driving your program maturity the most? When you think about it from a security standpoint, what is it? And how do you think about it? How do you go about it? So let's recap. And this is kind of the episode's theme, right? We're recapping all the previous couple of episodes because we're trying to think about how do we start from scratch or near scratch and build our overall security posture. So if you think about the scientific method that we were discussing over the vast amount of episodes we were talking about, incident response and just overall alerting and all those kind of items. So if you think about it from how do you start off again? Hey, we're trying to go through the normal baseline setting. Maybe we have a control tower and we have a centralized log archiving account. And this is one of the key pieces to think about is how are you centralizing logs? Because we're getting in different alerts. What's generating those alerts, right? And how do we start to move within our environment a certain way? And we have a question for Lewis. What are the main milestones of security lifecycle presented in recap, and how are the transitions between phases measured? So that's an interesting piece to look at it, right? What are the major milestones? And I think the milestones are stemming from just the overarching, hey, how do we handle incidents within our environment? And the place I would break that out into is mainly in 2 areas. The first area is, hey, how do we essentially structure our environment? Are we following a particular pattern or guidance? And then going to something like the security incident response technical guide. So if I were to share that out, let's go on a tangent. We always love tangents here. So if we were to look at the incident response guide itself, you start to see, hey, what is the first question here? Are you well architected? And do we have a well architected framework? And these are parts of the guides that help you to build out these milestones, right? Is starting out with the foundational pieces of your environment. Do you have the structure? And let's dive a little bit into this, right? Do you have the 6 pillars? Do you have operational excellence and the security pillar and so on and so forth? And then starting from there, diving a little bit in. It's like, okay, what builds into the security pillar? And when you figure that out, that's how you define the milestones for your organization, right? Because you're essentially taking these different pieces and you're shaping them to your organization, because these are known good working patterns, right? That have been built from a number of different customers and engagements and just people looking at things of how we can optimize this and kind of going from there, right? So when we start to think about it, and everything in 1AZ, save money, feeling fine. Thank you for that, Noll. So that could be one of the areas. It's like, hey, how can we get everything in 1AZ? But essentially what we're trying to get to is we're trying to think about, all right, if we have that baseline in place, logging always plays a part. And that 10 billion% sure part is, hey, if we're getting 10 billion alerts, how can we kind of triage that appropriately with automation? So we spoke about tamper-proof centralized log archiving, right? So the centralization piece eliminates that kind of fog that gets, I would say, spreads when you have maybe, let's say, 80 plus accounts, different regions, services. And essentially what you're doing is, instead of having to look at 80 separate accounts, you have a centralized mechanism that you can start to triage different items. And then you make sure that those logs that are getting centralized, they're immutable, right? And they are not able to be tampered in certain ways. So the question becomes like, okay, what logs? That's when we started to focus on CloudTrail and VPC full logs, Route 53 resolver queries. All these are different types of logs that all the organizations may not have everything turned on. They may say, hey, we have CloudTrail, but no VPC flow logs. And during the incident, you might need some VPC flow logs. But do you capture all of them? What is the retention rate, right? Because you can have a lot of VPC flow logs that are generated within your environment. And then that's where you start to get to the part of, hey, maybe we have to have some type of mechanism in order to, let's say, filter, so that we're not doing everything all at once. That's how we're starting to corral some of these logs and these alerts and mechanisms like that, right? So if you have that raw telemetry coming out from the API calls and network flows, DNS queries, so on and so forth, how can you transform that into a hypothesis-driven detection? And that's kind of the secret of how we were going down the path of automation. And also, I also love the Animaniacs too. Thank you, Ari, for that. So when you're starting to think about this and starting to dive into it, now you start to have a path forward. You start to think about it from a different perspective, because you're drawing a hypothesis. If something were to happen within my environment, now I can handle it in a multitude of ways, because I can draw a hypothesis of, I believe this should happen, and then go from there, right? Designing and building and creating maybe an event bridge rule that triggers a step function, right? That orchestrates a Lambda and systems manager runbook, something along those lines, right? And when you think of it in that area, then you can start to think, hey, within that piece, I have a lot of power to start to do something like revoke credentials, isolate EC2 via security groups. You have a lot of power when you have the right hypothesis to start out with. And knowing how to formulate that hypothesis is a very important part, because you can have a bunch of different detections and workflows, but you have to have an overarching picture of your environment with the foundational items that we were speaking about, the well-architected, and then going into security and looking at the security reference architecture, another great place to start off. And then think about how each stage of this process is interlocked and connected through the life cycle across your multitude of accounts, right? So when you start to think of it that way, you start to have questions formulated in your head. And to summarize, after you do the hypothesis, you test. And then sometimes you have that chaos engineering, which was one of the episodes of like, hey, why is chaos engineering good? Right? And Dell says, well, architect describes the official pillars good, but I look at everything outside of the application as scaffolding. You need more than a building. You need the scaffolding around your infrastructure. That is a good point, Dell. And that's where I want to emphasize. You want to always take that step back and use and know working patterns when it comes to securing your infrastructure. right? So you speak about the scaffolding. So if we come in from a security angle, then you start to think about, okay, the security reference architecture component, because the scaffolding that you build in there is maybe something like a control tower with landing zone enhancements. Now you have those different pieces that have been built up so you can start to populate the different applications and instances and things of that nature, right? Because one of the pieces of thinking about your overarching target state security strategy is exactly what you said. What are the building blocks? Even if you don't know what application goes into, your overarching picture yet, you want to have some baseline security fundamentals in place. Do you have SCP, service control policies? Do you have the different automation mechanisms in order to say, hey, if you have, let's say, an alert trigger goes to your centralized logging archiving account, where does it go next? Does it kick off automation? Does it go, a copy gets into a S3 bucket for an incident responder to take a look at? Does it go to your SIM, right? Is everything happening all at once? Or do you not have that next step defined yet? And exactly, CI/CD as well, right? So when you're building out your CI/CD as well, is you starting to get into the area of, okay, is everything getting scanned locally? And then maybe at the repository level, what are the checks and balances? Where are the human reviews? What are the human toll gates in there of saying, hey, this is approved? So there's a bunch of different pieces of the puzzle that you have to figure out. And it's all part of your overarching security strategy. And that's figuring out how everything interlocks together. Because as you mentioned, scaffolding, it builds in different areas, right? Is, okay, how are we going to, even though, do the CI/CD part, right? Where if you have CI/CD in your organization, there shouldn't be necessary ClickOps, right? Because everything should be going through that CI/CD pipeline that you built with the security tooling and the scanning and all those things and mechanisms built in that you can lock down via SCPs. And then with those SCPs, then what is allowed? Only the CI/CD pipeline roles, right? So now you start to build upon each other. And that's how you start to head towards getting 10 billion% reliability, because you're proving that the pipeline works through science, right? Your hypothesis. And you can also do fault injection testing and things of that nature to say, hey, failure scenarios, if something happens. Now, when you think about simulating these real conditions, you're terminating your instances, you're throttling your API, so on and so forth. Now you start to say, hey, do we have everything in place? Well, before you can answer that question, you have to go through the process of saying, hey, have we validate that the event bridge rules trigger, that the step functions complete, that the Lambda remediations behave exactly how we thought it was going to be, right? Because that's part of the hypothesis, is testing your hypothesis. So it's the same area of understanding, I created this hypothesis, I can trigger this alert, and I know 99.999% of the time, this is how the alert is going to end up and be triaged throughout my environment. You have to be able to validate and trace end to end. The detection event lands, triggers the event bridge rule pattern, so on and so forth. So we have a question from Lewis that says, what evidence was provided to demonstrate the activation of tools effectively reduce operational risk? So this is the interesting thing, is who are you trying to provide the evidence to? Is it you're providing the evidence for the sake of testing that, hey, we went through end to end that the process worked? Or are you validating it for a third party like an auditor, right? Where you have, hey, this is all of our evidence that says in this S3 bucket, it contains a polling interval or something along those lines that capture those bits of data, right? Or you can go through and show the logs and say, hey, on this date, we triggered and went through this event, this exercise, TDIR, all those kind of things. So that's where you effectively go through the process is one, identifying that piece, and then two, going through the process of having the mechanisms in place to one, have that captured, and two, having the place that you can prove it to auditors. Centralization, yes, AWS organization, and aggregate the savings. That's one of the big items is what we've seen with customers is when there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions, you have a lot of different mindsets that come into play because you have a lot of different security postures that just get mashed together, right? And one of the items that you have to do is take that step back to think about, okay, how does this account coming into the organization get absorbed? Does it go right into the OU structure? Do you have a separate OU structure that is acting like a transition period where you say, hey, you have this way of operating and we have to slowly move you over within this period of time with a defined date to meet current security requirements? Right? Because like I was saying, there might be some people who use CI/CD and others that use console because maybe they're new on their journey to the AWS cloud and they say, hey, we did ClickOps, we followed these items, but the maturity levels are different. Now you have to figure out a way to even these out. And the best way to do this is going through these processes and procedures of saying, hey, if something happens, this is how it happens, right? So there's a lot of risk, to your point. Legal risk, liability, not just the day-to-day, hey, can you add this so I can have my application launched? It's like, no, there's, legal holds and locks and all those kind of things, right? The regulatory requirements, depending on what framework. How long do you have to keep the data for? How long do you have to keep the logs for? Which logs do you have to keep? That's where you take that pause and you're like, huh. You start to feel it because you can go through all that and you feel your heart kind of going faster, right? It is a lot, but that's why we take that step back. And we do things like build playbooks. We build, let's say, game days. These type of exercises, they help you to test out your different scenarios, your thought process, your hypothesis. Right? It helps you to generate new ones because you start to have those different muscles being worked out in such a way so that when it comes across you, you say, okay, we have this exercise to test this. We have this period of time, this chunk of time carved out to actually think about this. And it's not all ad hoc, which, sometimes happens because you're building and rushing to develop. But you have to remember that you have to take that step back. Security, top priority. So you have to make it fit into the schedule in a certain way. So the way to do this is, one, work backwards from a game day. Work backwards from a tabletop exercise where you sit down with the different stakeholders and say, hey, we have an EC2 compromise alert. How do we handle it? Go. Right? Simple thing like that. And if the process is not clear to everyone in the room that's supposed to triage and supposed to understand the process, then you start to say, okay, what do we have to change? And that's kind of where it starts to build itself. And again, I always reference going back to something like security response guide. Why? Because now you start to get to the part of saying, hey, what do we do for CloudTrail logs? Which logs are important? Why are logs like VPC flow logs important to incident response? Why do we have to have DNS and Route 53 resolver queries? All pieces of the puzzle that we have to go through. So part of this is understanding, going through the process, but pieces of this is also just built upon just a simple aspect of, hey, how do we continue to evolve and grow? Well, part of that is looking at known patterns, looking at validating the different pieces, right? Yeah. Scaffolding, implementation, compliance, right? You say compliance, you whisper it a little bit, right? All those little things that come into place. So it's known patterns. There's somebody who has traversed this path before for the majority of the point or the part. Or I heard it both ways, right? So the line that always comes back to me is, it's dangerous to go alone. All right, take a friend. Or you can sit down and, let's traverse this path together. And the best way I know how is going through, side quests. So that's where we join us in our session of, let's say, how do we say? Oh, as side quest legend has it. Never get tired of saying that, right? Where this is a segment of the show where we deep dive into a customer story and scenario where, hey, it's a fictitious customer, but it's real thoughts, real hypotheses that come out. And the way we kind of go through this is with our handy dandy side quest board, where we have a customer scenario. So let's say we have a fictitious healthcare organization. And maybe after migrating their electronic health records, their different research into different pipelines, maybe they say, hey, we did well. We have maybe 47 hospitals, we have 31 petabytes, we have so many pieces of data that is protected, and we follow the standards of HIPAA and high trust and all those good things. We have centralized logging. We have security lake with OCSF, right? So, as always, then a gap appeared and a gap emerged, right? So maybe after taking that victory lap, when they started to go through their recertification, because, as Dell says, compliance. If we're starting to go through that process again, let's call it vital stream, right? Let's just say vital stream. That sounds fictitious. So going through that process, they saw that, hey, something's off. Something is not right. So they go through the reports and they try to validate the response from a chaos experiment that they did beforehand. And something changed. Something within the environment. But the logging was there. The detections were there. The containment had worked, right? They went through all these different pieces. But no one can prove how they were connected exactly. Nobody can figure out how the triggers, let's say, triggered. Well, did they know the entire life cycle of what happened? Well, that's kind of how we dive in a little bit. So if we have our board with our standard AWS account and S3 account, let's say we have a trigger for maybe random unauthorized user. Now we have to think about all these different items that we were just talking about. We have logging in place, right? That was one of the key metrics that we designated to say, hey, we have the different pieces of logging. Maybe we have something like CloudWatch in place that, is monitoring the CloudTrail logs, and it's going through and understanding these different components, right? So, hey, if we started off in this manner, fashion, and form, this seems like a typical scenario, right? CloudTrail and CloudWatch is going to our centralized logging archive account. But, something happened. There was a gap. There was something we were trying to fill, especially during our chaos experiment. There was some loop that wasn't closed. And how do we go through? How do we figure out those different pieces? I think one of the places to start is, do we have something like a step function in place? And that step function can trigger based off of what's happening within the environment. So if an alert was triggered in such a way that it went through our automation workflow, now with our automation workflow, we have CloudTrail alert says, hey, there's an unauthorized user attempt for something within our environment. So now we have to figure out let's say the stages where we go from logging to detection to response to validation, maybe forensics, and then maybe a little bit of improvement sprinkled on at the end. So I think something that we can dive into a little bit within the environment as I slide in detective face up is, how do we trace back exactly what happened within the overarching environment? It's all key pieces of the puzzle. So if we are going down the path of trying to figure out, in our case, a vital stream is, hey, there was a gap within the environment. The alert detection didn't trigger correctly. The question I pose to all of you out there in chat is, when or how do you have that moment of, hey, the loop isn't closed, the end-to-end isn't working, right? And how did you figure it out? Was it the same misconfiguration that caused 3 different incidents? Because the lesson was never really implemented to kind of close it out? Or was it through leadership where they said, hey, they thought this finding was remediated and it came up again when we were going through compliance? Or maybe the game day that passes once a year, right? Where it says, hey, did you run those tests? And no, we haven't. I think those are all pieces of the puzzle that leads to more questions, more hypotheses, because the question that starts to stem from all that is, who's built every stage of this? Because even in our simple diagram and show right here, we have multiple different areas that we have to consider, right? We have a step function here getting fed something. What are the steps? What are the actions that it's taking? And I think that's the key part of the puzzle we need to kind of dive into. Because when that question hits, everything somewhat goes silent, I should say. And when you say, hey, we had that gap filled, right? That finding was taking, we had a remediation and it wasn't because it happened again. That's where you hear different kind of music play. Usually a little bit sadder, a little bit softer, right? It's not the same like, hey, we're ready to go. It's like, hey, we missed something. And how do we know that we can continue to say, we're 10 billion% sure this won't happen again? And that's where we take that step back and hit the good old pause game button, the Zach Morris timeout, as I would call it. And we start to think about it from a different perspective of, did we implement everything we just said? Do we have the chaos engineering? Do we have the different hypotheses in place? How do we turn evidence into knowledge? And that's where we recapped forensics and lessons learned. How can we take something like an EBS snapshot, isolated instances, and maybe immutable logs, and put them in a dedicated forensics account? Do we have that path? Do we have that trigger in place? And if you do, I would say, cheers, clap, all those good things, right? That's something you want, right? All these applause and cheers. But in order to figure this out, you have to go through the process. You have to understand from end to end what is happening when the logs come in. What are the containment actions that are taken, right? So is it the action terminates the instance? Does it isolate the resource? Is there a response in the pipeline to capture something like an EBS snapshot? So these are the mechanisms that you have to go through, and making sure that your chain of custody is not broken. Because when you have logs, right, do you have something like, immutable logs where something wasn't tampered with? Do you have something like an S3 object lock? Because we were talking about, our S3 bucket a moment ago. Do we have the ability to centrally query, leveraging something like Amazon Athena, right? Where you have this S3 bucket, you have these different items in place, and you can make ad hoc queries as an incident responder in order to delve into exactly what happened at that moment in time. Is that part of your step? Is that part of your SIM optimization? Because all those strategies come into play, right? Because if you send everything to your SIM, are you going through and treating everything? Have you tweaked everything in your SIM? Because there could be different criticality levels based on your industry, your compliance standards, all those kind of things. And is there a mechanism built into that SIM where somebody can dive in? That's where you start to ask a lot of questions, especially from the standpoint of just, right, if we have an incident, can we go through the process? And we spoke about this in a previous episode where you can codify blameless post-incident findings into a version-controlled detection, for lack of better words, right? So that's a key component. And yeah, thank you for mentioning it as well, because Athena is a key place where you can have a natural language query, and it says like, I want to find these type of logs, creates it into a query format, and then from there it goes through the logs based on that specification, which will help you during your investigation, during your learning, your lessons, your next steps, all those kind of things. So when you start to think about it from that perspective, now you have that post-incident standpoint where do you have the ability to codify? Like, how do we rectify this piece? So that it's not necessarily put it into a wiki page or a Confluence page or something along that and kind of forgotten because it's like, hey, we found this out and we should take these steps. Okay, what are the steps that we should take? Last updated last year, 2025, right? That's not the message you want to see after you go through something like an incident, right? Where it's like, oh, this happened before. You want to make sure that there's a way to codify so that you can continue to mature your overarching security design, your security plan, your target state security strategy, your incident response plan. But spoilers on the incident response plan. So when you start to go down that route, now you start to see how everything kind of fits together, because that's part of, these different pieces clicking together and knowing how the gears fit together, right? And knowing how to grease those different gears so that they fit together properly, right? And yes, check Confluence, right? It's in there. So when you go through that place, as I mentioned, you want to have that overarching mechanism so that you continue to get better and understand the different threats within your environment, and overarchingly reduce and demonstrate the ability to continuously reduce the dwell time and reoccurring rates over a period of time. Right? So as you continue to evolve your overall security posture, now you start to say, hey, how long before a potential threat actor, how long before they're found? How long can they persist before detection? And how often does, let's say, the same issue, the same root cause return within your environment? As a trended metric across all incidents, right? So your MTTC and MTTR, right? You want to figure out a mechanism to do all of this, because one, part of that compliance that Dell whispered, right? SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA, all those kind of things, but also part of your different mechanisms that you're implementing into your environment itself. Because if you are going down that path of, say, setting up different alerts and different automations and step functions, those should be based on where you're trying to head with your target state security strategy. Right? And that's where you take some of the different pieces that was mentioned before of like, hey, security reference architecture and building out your AWS organizations, designing your SCPs, or to Dell's point, the scaffolding that goes around them, right? All these different pieces add up. But you kind of have to know, hey, when or how do we handle building in these automations, right? How do we know that, hey, we need to do more? And I think part of that question is do you trust the automations within your environment? Which is an interesting concept, right? So feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat to say, hey, what stops your team from automating more responses? Is it the fear of automating the wrong action? Is it not enough engineering time? It's hard to get approval and buy-in, or we just don't trust it. We rather have a manual output, a manual person go through the logs, right? So these are all things that you start to hear and see a lot, right? And not enough engineering time. Seen that before, right? Because there's a product launch, or hey, we have this audit come in, so we have to put this into place and we'll refine it later, and kind of goes on and on, right? So another piece of that is the current maturity level if you're operating within AWS at scale. Is it the fear of automating the wrong action that could hinder your growth or hinder development? That's where you take that, step back, dramatic pause, and you start to think about, hey, where do we go from here? And most likely two in some cases, back to grep. Yeah, it's interesting, right? And Vic, I'm ready. If you're ready to think about it and get excited about charting that path forward. See the little transitions. I try my best. So when you start to think about it that way, is how do you get excited about all of this, right? We went through alerting. We went through kind of the structure, the chaos engineering, why all these things matter within the organization. But how do we get excited about charting that path forward, right? This is the thing that comes down to every explorer, every scientist's heart. How do we move in a way that we are able to identify the gaps between our coverage and our response automation across its full life cycle, end to end? Well, part of that comes from using some type of, I always go towards like threat detective or something like MITRE ATT&CK or Stride or one of the different frameworks to kind of map everything out to understand what are we building, why are we building, how are we building it, how is everybody building within the organization, because a security person might build something different from a regular developer. Hopefully, right, is more security in mind. But sometimes it's having the mechanisms and identifying those silent gaps within your environment and tracing them through the different life cycles to say, okay, without blame, let us figure out the next steps of how we can close that gap. So it stays silent forever because it's gone, right? This is part of the improvement items. And part of that is quantitative data, right? What's science without quantitative data? It's establishing your mean time to contain, your mean time to recover, all these different M and then whatever goes after it, right? It's figuring out all these different pieces. And that's a starting point as well. Because once you start to have measurable service levels and the different objectives that go through it, then you can start to implement that automation, right? The CloudWatch, the Security Hub. To say it, I'll just go through the list of 10, right? So if you think about that, you start to say, hey, can we move towards this metric? Are we at this metric? Where's the industry right now? And that's where some of that background comes into play when it comes to leveraging different well-architected and security reference architecture and so on and so forth. And also I mentioned and should mention the AWS security blogs, right? And why do I mention that? And not say, hey, maybe just go through, the normal course of just general certificate knowledge, right? Yeah, go through the different exams and the tests and things of that nature, because you're able to go on knowledge quests this way, right? And what is a knowledge quest? If you're new here, well, a knowledge quest is essentially those deep dives, those reads after your 5 a.m. run, after you grab the beverage of your choice, coffee, tea, water, or other, and you sit down and say, hey, I need to find known security patterns that can help my organization grow and mature in certain ways, right? It's also something that can help you build aura, right? That's one of the taglines, right? Knowledge quest, you could go through, you could build aura, you can have your own DevSecOps chronicles where you shift left, or you can have a song of compliance and controls. I can keep going all day with these. But essentially, you're starting to go through those different pieces of documentation so that if you're starting out as a L100, right, you have beginner level knowledge. You're kind of like that village apprentice, right? You can't blacksmith yet. You could just watch. You can't, toe the fields, or I don't know farmer lingo, but go through that process of understanding. Where do you start with that? And I think the key place to understand is exactly where we started earlier. And that's by going through and understanding, hey, security pillars, right? But even before that is understanding, hey, what is Security Hub, CSPM versus Security Hub? Do I know what the differences are between the two? Can I go through that? That's where you start out at level 100. And then eventually you go to say, hey, what's security like? What is guard duty? I would go down guard duty. Understand it. You know why? Because with guard duty, if we come closer, when you look at guard duty, you start to think about, hey, what are the different findings? And if we were to dive in, my favorite thing to look at when you're having conversations is if you just simply say, hey, what are the different findings? And you could say EC2 findings. And you could delve into saying, hey, what is the EC2 finding? What is the IAM finding? What is the different attack sequences? And you can go through and say, hey, for this type of alert, this is what gets generated, right? What are the data sources of this? One of those things, VPC flow logs. Interesting, right? All these things are pieces of the puzzle that you start to build up and leverage in your knowledge base, right? So that you can have a mechanism to form your hypothesis with. So that you can say, hey, now that I know what the different finding types are, if we take guard duty, for example, if we take CloudTrail, for example, if we take these different mechanisms, now we can start to figure out, what a workflow state is. We can dive into different tutorials and so on and so forth, everything here. But essentially the takeaway from this is figuring out, okay, what's the important part of this? What are some of the best practices? If we click here. So if we look at the best practices, surprise, what does it say? How do we optimize costs? How do we understand tagging? How do we go through and avoid latency? That could be a big thing, especially if you have, I don't know, maybe let's say 10 billion alerts. That number keeps coming up, right? So if we have 10 billion alerts, how do we figure out, how do we take all those alerts and triage them so they're handled appropriately, right? So you start to think about and understand these different items. Those are kind of quests that you go on. So structured learning, questioning, yeah, that's the thing, is there are multiple ways to go about this, right? Learning is important. And whatever works for your organization or for yourself is all pieces of the puzzle. right? So you are going through and understanding, hey, how do we take that step back and go from an L100 villager to a science engineer, right? That's part of the question, because you can have the base level information, the knowledge, but looking at security patterns, leveraging the different generative AI and agentic AI agents out there are very important to the overall learning process, right? Because you can start to think of things in a different manner. You can start to say, hey, connect the dots in a different way so that you can understand the roles that automation plays, the roles that, you know, different items within your environment. I should say different stages items within your environment have to go through. So that you say, hey, I understand kind of the testing methodology. I understand what the security reference architecture does. And you can take the next step. So, sidetracked, but we kind of ended up in that place, right? So, let's take that step back again, because if you haven't noticed, we go off the rails here a lot and we come back on somehow. So, if we start to think about science engineer, we start to think about how we take that next step. Well, that next step is with automation and understanding different pieces of automation and rules that you can have within your environment. So if you look at understanding, hey, surprisingly, within the CSPM, now you can start to figure out, hey, how do I create automation rules within the Security Hub CSPM, right? And you say, okay, I know the basics. I know the difference between Security Hub and CSPM. Now I can start to think about, how do I test, right? How do I go through that process? Especially with something like the fault injection service, where you can start to think about items in a different manner because, like, hey, I can actually test these items out. I can start going through and understanding the different pieces of the puzzle. That's how I can reconstruct and use something like detective to help better my overall security presence, my security posture by understanding what happened within my environment, be able to trace down and walk through the attacker's entire path step by step using something like behavioral graphs. That's the important part, because behavioral graphs, finding the connections, you kind of see the reoccurring theme is you're trying to figure out how the gears fit together, how they interlock together, so that you can start to build automations, so that you can build repositories, so that you can manage something like your logs, right? And if you leverage something like Athena, like, all right, we have everything go to Security Lake, for example. Now you can leverage different mechanisms to query said lake. And you keep going down the line and you start to think about incident management. You start to think about how the response guide comes back into play. I keep going towards the response guide because I say this is a really important part of reading. I would say if you're going through and understanding the different parts of the security, incident response user guide, you can work backwards from a lot of different items so that you can understand, hey, what does good look like, right? And to your point, hard to build the experience for early learners and entry-level people. And this is the interesting part, Dell, right? You have all of these different mechanisms where if you're coming in at that L100 and you're trying to make to L200 level of understanding, you have the different mechanisms and tools that you can use. And they range from the workshops, they range from the documentation, the different pieces of architecture, and just breaking those things down and understanding, saying, hey, if I were to take this step of incident response, do I know all of the different patterns that are known security patterns within this guide, right? Of, hey, where do we start with logs? Do we just capture CloudTrail, or do we have a trifecta of the CloudTrail, VPC, flow logs, Route 53 resolver queries? Well, if you start at the guide, kind of hints towards this is what kind of logs you would treat during an incident. And then after you have those fundamentals down, then you can start to get into measuring the time objectives and the MTTC, the MTTRs, and so on and so forth, right? And that's where you can start to prove the maturity and prove your growth within your organization. So that's how, when you have those mechanisms, you start to go towards that place of being 10 billion%, let's say, reliable, sure, or understanding that, yeah, I'm kind of somewhat of a detection architect myself. I went through the different courses, like, say from Security Side Quest, and said, hey, I need to learn. I need to dive in some more. I know some of the fundamentals, some of the different pieces I have to put into place with my environment. And I compared it against known patterns because I looked at something like the security reference architecture, and we have the building blocks in place, right, for using organizations, using the different account structures with the management account and security account and so on and so forth in order to help build my organization. And I think that's one of the parts. And the other piece is just figuring out those prescriptive guidance patterns. That's how you start to become that 10 billion%, detection architect. And one of the last pieces, I would say, if we were to take the step all the way back to understanding, I think a key place that I would say is, no matter what route you go through, if you do the certificate knowledge, or you dive in, or you ask the agents, or you look into the documentation, right, is one, just playing and understanding with each piece, one piece at a time, so that you get that 1 XP at a time. And what happens with that 1 XP or experience point? You eventually level up. And it's not just yourself, but it's your overall organization. And that just helps everybody with building out a security incident response plan. I had to do it one time for Russ. And I also had to say it, 3 other times. Incident response plan, incident response plan. I say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. So with that being said, we'll close out on that fun item of becoming 10 billion% complete with this episode, because we understand the AWS security lifecycle from end to end somewhat. So if you missed any of these pieces, feel free to come back every Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll continue to chat about it. So until next time, have fun, happy Monday, and take care. Cheers.